Here we are, Jeff. Welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, great to be with you, Guy.
I was obviously we were saying off there. It's amazing. It's been literally 4 years. It wouldn't be far off to the day, I would imagine, something like
Hmm.
that. So time flies, time
It
flies,
does.
and it's great to have
Yeah,
you back.
it's great to be here. It's great to have you be a father now and spread the good vibes.
I'm doing my best, mate. I'm doing my best, and I'm going to ask the same question I ask everyone on the show before we dive in, because obviously when you flicked me an email through, I lit up straight away and I was like, "Oh my god, we've got to talk about this on the show
Hmm.
today." But if you were at a dinner table right now and you sat next to a complete stranger and they asked you what you did for a living, what would you say?
I would say I'm a scientist at heart and an artist at heart. It's trying to mix the two to figure out how to make well-being normal on Earth instead of a rare occasion.
What does normal well-being look like to you, Jeff? Because
Yeah,
the
and I
world
wouldn't say
doesn't feel
normal
normal
well-being.
right
I'm
now.
saying I'm saying make full well-being normalized. Um, where when someone stops what they're doing and sits still, they're enjoying the fact of being, the fact of existing, just really pure. I think we have a culture where it's so used to distraction and numbing ourselves from things, and people's worst nightmare a lot of the time would be in like a white room with nothing in it, because they'd have to actually deal with all the things that are inside. And so for me, well-being means I'm coherent inside. My inside is coherent, and so actually, I enjoy just being. It's not a problem that I have to work through. It's actually a joy in itself.
Yeah, beautiful. How long did it take you, or at what point did you realize that you weren't being? So in your life, there's always a journey to get to that point,
Mm.
isn't there? And I think once we get to that point, we want to share the wisdom and what we've learned that's impacted our lives so deeply that we just want to spread the message and help others with it. So I'm fascinated with you, Jeff. Where was the tipping point for you?
And the tipping point for where it actually became joyful, or the tipping point where I knew it wasn't
Or,
joyful.
yeah, or your tipping point where you knew, where you thought, I actually got to look more inward than outward.
Oh yeah, that was a really clear point in my life. So, just to even kind of precursor that a little bit, by the time I was 10, I was an
Please.
insomniac. I was already seeing a doctor for that, and 15, depression. And, so I knew there was something off pretty early, but in our culture, we consider that almost always a chemical imbalance, and we try to add other chemicals to treat it instead of actually pointing to the fact that the fact I felt bad was actually intelligent. Things were not actually well in my life. So that that took quite a while, but I would say the next 15 years of that I spent jumping around Maslow's hierarchy, trying to accomplish everything that I felt would actually fulfill the hole that was inside. And that took me from, I went to MIT, I studied math and physics, I was going to be a professor. Then I went into robotics and I started making robotic artwork, all these things that they were extremely enjoyable and satiated the curiosity and the passion I had in life. But they didn't seem to actually fulfill, just like when I stopped. Was I just feeling that joy of being? And that all culminated when I hosted a TV show called Time Warp on Discovery Channel. So I hosted that show in like 2007 to 2009 for 3 years. We did 3 seasons. And this was one of those moments where it was like, wow, everything on the list is accomplished. I'm making good money. I got a nice place to live. I have a girlfriend. I've got this job. People recognize me on the street. Like, just what could be wrong? And at the same time, I was the most stressed I've ever been. I was the most kind of incoherent, just out of balance with myself that I've ever been. And when I stopped, it was just like, what is going on? And so when that show didn't get renewed for the next season, and I didn't go back to finish my PhD that I had taken a leave of absence from, all of a sudden I had nowhere else I knew to look. And so it was just like, okay, I don't have any idea what to do now. I'm just, there's no more parts of I had the social esteem and all that sort of thing. So where do you go? And what that made really clear was that it was really about my mind. It was really not about my life circumstances that were going to create my well-being. It was about me and the way that I judged the way my life was going. So that was just a huge turning point where kind of everything stopped. I had enough money saved that I didn't need to go find another thing, which would have become another distraction. And so I just spent the next 2 years reading about well-being and just voraciously trying to find anything that would be not superficial and not symptomatic, because that's all the things that I had found earlier. I had been on antidepressants, and it's like they shift something in the direction of feeling better on this much of the surface, but they didn't act. It was very clear to my body that they didn't get to the core of what was going on.
Get to the core, yeah. What was the first step into that world then for you? So you start reading the information, and I'm always fascinated because when we get to that point, and I've certainly been there too in my own journey, it's fucking overwhelming. You're like, where do I go? What do I do? How do I deal with this? And it can be terrifying to start to look at what emotions are being held and sort of diving inward to oneself to discover what that root is. So, like, what was the catalyst for you where you kind of went, holy shit, that makes sense. I'm going to try this. I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
And start applying it in your life.
Well, just to give you kind of like a reference point of how insane my mind was in terms of like closed-minded views about how to find well-being. I had learned the basics of meditation, but I wouldn't do it because it was too woo-woo, like new age for me back in this 2008, And so the first thing I needed to find was I read neuroscientists talking about the benefits of meditation. Deeper compassion, deeper sense of gratitude in life, increased well-being. And then I was like, okay, like I can extricate this from religious overtones and there's a clear benefit. So that started me in the kind of like tiniest trickle of something, because I knew it was about something inside in here. But what really started the trip out, the emotional landscape didn't change actually for probably 5 more years. But what the biggest first tipping point was getting exposed to Nisargadatta's work, who's an Indian guru from Bombay. And, as I said, I was voraciously reading. I was probably reading 2 books a week for 2 years. And each one I'd go back on Amazon, like people that read this, liked this. And I would just follow the breadcrumb trail basically of deeper and deeper and deeper to the core. And I read all these things that just felt like you don't seem to understand at all what's really at the core here. And then I found this Amazon review that brought me to tears. And sometimes when I even recount it, it brings me to tears, because the Amazon review of transcribed dialogues from this guru, Nisargadatta, said, "You've been searching long and hard for a book that will actually get to the root of the issues with the nature of reality. And this is the book. Get this book and read it and put it away and put all your books away and do the things that he says to try, the experiments on yourself, on the nature of your consciousness, and you will come to know what's really going on with reality." And, this is a guru who, like, as I said, I had a lot of triggers around religion and new ageness at that time in my life. Now there's a whole different landscape we can get into. But at that time, that was like a big block for me. But this guru, he's a Bombay native, and he sold cigarettes in a cigarette shop, and he smoked his whole life, and he died of throat cancer. And he didn't follow any of the kind of normal, like, I am this kind of holy thing. He was actually, if you look up videos of him, he's basically just yelling at everybody. People are asking him questions, and he'll just yell at them that your question is based on false assumptions of reality, and so I can't even answer your question. And that's how a lot of his dialogues work. They expose the hidden belief systems that you're already bringing as a framework into reality. And so one of the hugest turning points for me was realizing that some aspects of spirituality are not at all about adding new beliefs. They're about letting go of beliefs that you already have. And that was such a shift for the kind of like atheist mind that I was holding. It was such a shift that it just turned the whole world upside down. All of a sudden, I saw these certain paths of spirituality as actually that I believed more than they did, and that I needed to let go of certain beliefs to open myself up to what might be true. And that was just a mind fuck for a scientifically oriented mind, that usually was like not interested in learning from gurus and things like that.
Amazing. Yeah, it's definitely a journey of unlearning, isn't it? Quite often
Totally,
with this
totally. You could
work.
say that all trauma and conditioning is stuff that you and your ancestry learned that a lot of the times it's just over here, so you don't even have it in your view. And as Jung said, until you make that unconscious conscious, you will call it fate, and it will determine your whole life. And that's what was happening.
Yeah. Wow. Well, what I love about you, Jeff, and even from our last conversation and that is that you're somebody that has got an academic background. Like, I mean, I think there's, I don't know, it's not many people that have studied quantum mechanics and that I've even had on the show, right? And I guess my question to you is, because what we are seeing here in Australia is when people come to our workshops and even in the retreat, everything is trying to be solved from the mind, which you're talking to now. And quite often, the more academic a person is, the more they lean on the mind to try and solve something that they haven't looked at that's beyond the
Mm-hmm.
mind.
Mm-hmm.
What would your advice be to your old self or to somebody right now listening to this? Because I guarantee there'll be people listening right now that are right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a couple things. The first one is that pretty much anything the mind believes can be deconstructed and seen as not fully true. And if you're open to it, you can always find the holes in your own belief structure. Like, if you really want to put one of these things to the test, sit with someone and try to prove to them that some of these beliefs are true. And you'll start to, if you're open, you have to have the openness to it. You'll start to see the framework that you've created around them. That's part one. Part two is coming in touch with metacognitive awareness, letting yourself actually notice that the thoughts are not you and that you are the observer of those thoughts is a huge shift in your future relationship with yourself. Because usually thought and awareness are conflated in an adult. And that's just, we don't even talk about it. And so, of course, that's what happens. You sit around and think all day, but if you stop to notice it, you're thinking in a language that you learned. I'm not thinking in Chinese, I'm thinking in English. And that took me several years to learn, which means for several years, I existed just fine as an aware being before that language actually came in here and started hallucinating auditorily. So once again, if I'm receptive to it, it's not me. It's an object I'm paying attention to, just like my vision is an object I'm paying attention to. And so who is that me? So disidentifying from that content. And that takes work because we have, not only individually, but culturally, we have an addiction to thinking. And as you said, so many people, like 99% of their attention is here. And when you ask them to identify, where are you? Well, they're usually like an inch behind their eyes. None of that stands up to any scrutiny, by the way, but that's where it is. But if you ask like an indigenous native, they'll often point here where they are, or they'll point to their gut as actually where the center of themselves is. And we have different centers of being, but in our modern world, we tend to really focus our attention on the head. The last thing I'd say about your question is that one other thing that you have to be really receptive to this one without like working with a coach or something like that to come in touch with it, but to really see that a lot of the time, the thoughts that you have that are uncomfortable are actually contrary to it's like totally contrary to expectation. These uncomfortable thoughts that might be like, should I do this or should I do this, are actually a protection mechanism from feeling something more uncomfortable. And so just to ground it, I'll give a really simple example. I was in a relationship and I was like, should I stay in this relationship? Should I not? And when I was in a coaching session and got challenged around that, basically like if you couldn't make that decision, if you had to stay in the relationship, what would happen? It got really clear that I was angry at my partner and I was afraid to tell them that I was angry about something. And so instead of feeling the level of intensity of being fully there in my relationship and the consequences of that might come back at me, including anger coming back, my mind would much rather decide, should I stay in this relationship at all? And as soon as I got in touch with that, it was very clear that, a lot of my life was repressing my true self to protect myself from people getting angry and from people having reactivity. And it's very easy to just kind of suffocate your life force if you do that. And when you get somatically attentive, it's really clear to feel how much tension that puts in the body. So those are, 3 or 4 of the ways that I would start looking at the nature of relationship with thought.
Yeah, brilliant. It's interesting, Jeff, because I am currently listening to a book called The Secrets of Aboriginal Healing
Mm,
by Gary and Robbie Holtz. And it's a fabulous book. And the first two things they mentioned was the first thing to healing, and this is what they practice, obviously for thousands of years, is willingness, is have a
mm,
willingness to go there and to feel. And then the second step then is to have an awareness, which is
mm,
exactly that, coming in
mm,
to those things.
mm,
What would you say then to why are we so frightened to go there then? What has
mm.
been your journey?
We, as a whole culture, like modern people, forget that they're animals. We've just covered up so many of the full range of dynamics that are in our bodies, and so we're all conditioned to fear the fullness of ourselves. And in a lot of the kind of deepest, healing experiences I've had, what it feels like is there's an eruption of your true animal nature that's like breaking through all your ideas of how you need to and should be because of all your conditioning and all your family and all your culture. And so it's, there's been plenty of moments during that kind of work where my nervous system really thought I was going to die if I went in the direction of where the fear was. And and that's really intelligent because, just to give context, like, we all grew up. I still haven't met anyone who grew up in an unconditionally loving family and society, right? We're all passing down conditioned patterns and trauma for thousands of years at this point, and have had, if we're lucky, we've had a little exposure to that. We can do something with that, but most people haven't. So we're all walking around kind of like neck up, terrified of the animal intensity that's waiting for us underneath, and that it happens to be our freedom. It happens to actually be where all the liveliness and of being is waiting. But there's this, like, if like, to use a chemical term, there's an activation energy that's required. That willingness and that awareness are an activation energy that allow you to go into a place that you've been resisting your whole life, and then to unlearn the patterns that your nervous system has learned about what's actually okay. The first time I let myself, for example, let out anger in my body that I had repressed my whole life, like I had never had a memory of letting anger out of my life. And the first time I let it through, my nervous system said, if you do this, you're going to get attacked, because that was actually in my conditioned patterning. So to do it in a safe environment and to not get attacked and actually feel the relief of that, it's safe to feel this thing fully, and I come out on the other side more free, was utterly profound. And I think it's something that, like, it's just such a not the cultural norm right now that we don't have examples of it. And actually, one of the things that's most interesting to me is you're starting to see in media well-known people, like famous celebrities and things like that, starting to be open about these facts. And you're starting to see the tide shift where in 10 years, I think it's going to be a cultural norm where people actually are discussing trauma and understanding conditioned patterns. And it's one of the most beautiful things to me in the world, because as soon as the people that we look up to permission that it's okay to feel all this stuff, that's when we're going to really see the acceleration of it.
Yeah, totally. We've seen a shift here. Obviously, the last 2.5 years haven't helped in
Mm,
separating people and isolating them. But even just from the workshops we ran on the weekend, people are coming in close. You could see they're all in their heads. They're all, wary. And by the end of the day, there's a thirst and a hunger and a real
mm,
deep connection for everyone and respect for everyone in the room that just isn't happening in society. And it's like
mm.
everyone's thirsty, but they don't know quite how to have it take a drink yet, to feed that, and they're looking. So that's exciting to me.
Yeah, there's a thing that I'm sure that you've seen. Go ahead. I was just going to say, I'm sure you've seen it in your workshops where um, there's a thing that I call a permission spiral. As soon as someone steps in and does the difficult thing, and everyone gets to witness that, the whole group just shifts down into a new place. And that's one of the things that interests me about setting up a 30-day long container, is actually like letting the nervous system reintegrate deeper and deeper, that actually all of these things are safe, and I can just stay there for weeks and let my nervous system, like, remember what it was like to be deconditioned or unconditioned.
100%. Never heard it being called that, permission spiral, but 100%. And it happened on both workshops. And what you see is that it's almost like it gives everyone permission to go, actually, we're not here to just have a good time. We do crack a lot of jokes and have a bit of fun along the way, for sure. You know, we want to keep it joyful, but at the same time, we're actually here to do work. And if you're ready, let's go, kind of thing, you know, and it's a beautiful thing to witness. So my next question to you is, which is, you know, why we're back on the show today, is to talk about your new project, Sleepawake. And I'm intrigued to know, when did the concept come about, and why did you call it Sleepawake? Like, what was the creativity brewing behind it that led you to take action and actually go ahead and do this? Because as somebody that facilitates myself, I can appreciate how much energy and effort it takes to not only conceptualize something, but then action it, put it together, and make those visions a reality, which is what you're doing, which, by the way, is amazing, mate. I just love it. Love it.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for asking. And it's as someone who's made a lot of large sculptures, you know, 100-foot long sculptures in atriums and things like that, I have a deep appreciation for the fact that the idea is 2 to 3% of a thing, you know, and actually putting in the time and effort and work to transform it into the manifest universe is where most of the work actually is. And I love a lot of the ideas that I've had, but it's nothing to keep it as an idea. It's really about that transformation into the manifest world. So I was doing group facilitation work out in California, really beautiful scenarios like the ones that you've referenced about really seeing people transform with each other, and mostly adult professionals. And COVID hit, all that kind of stuff stopped. I stopped working out in California. I moved back to Boston. And in that depth of that shutdown, I was really trying to focus in, like, what do I want to do with this? You know, it's like everyone was put on hold in some way or other when COVID hit from their normal patterning. And there's an author, David Data, I assume that you're familiar with, and he talks about kind of masculine and feminine dynamics. And one of the things he talks about with the masculine, and that's a whole rabbit hole of just defining masculine and feminine, but one of the things about masculine energy is finding that sense of connected purpose. And I really love the way that he said the way to do it is to just sit still and just be uncomfortable with not knowing what that is, and just sit and just sit and just sit. And that's what I did for probably 6 months after I stopped working in California. I just sat and I was just letting myself be uncomfortable with not knowing what that next thing was, but not overly distracting myself from it. And then just following these breadcrumbs of excitement. And for me, it just, all of a sudden, everything just kind of, all these swirls that have been happening for months just kind of like coalesced immediately after 6 months. And they all pointed to the same thing, which is, what would have created the deepest shift in my well-being in my life at any point? If there could have been an intervention point, what would it have been? And I realized that it would have been right around, there's this Goldilocks zone right around when someone goes to college. You know, 18 to 24 is the age we're targeting right now. There's a Goldilocks zone, because the earlier that you can work with someone on the depths of their understanding about the nature of being human, their emotional intelligence, their relational intelligence, their embodiment, the earlier you can do that, the easier it is to shift conditioned patterns. But I've worked with people in high school, and when you work with someone in high school, at the end of the day, they go home to their family, which is usually the source of all those conditioned patterns. And so if you start to open those up, you know, the intelligence of these conditioned patterns is that you learn them to survive in your family. We all had to learn different strategies to actually survive, whether that's people pleasing or repressing our emotions or getting aggressive, even, like, all those things were intelligent at the time. And so I find that if you open those things up too prematurely, it can destabilize their family dynamic before they're in a place where they're actually okay to do so. And that doesn't feel really responsible and safe to me. So right when someone leaves home, they're already shifting their entire social dynamic, and you can really expose the conditioned patterns and the habit patterns that they've formed for their survival. So that's true for me as well. You know, between 18 and 23 would have been like just this perfect Goldilocks zone where I was repressing so many different feelings that all felt wrong, and no one around me was doing any different. And so I didn't have any example of how else to be. But if someone had come in there and said, like, oh, look, here's all these limiting beliefs that you have about life. Here's all these emotions that you're repressing. Here's how they work together. Here's the ways you've disconnected from your body, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here's your metacognitive awareness about the fact that you aren't actually your thoughts. Most of my depression was rumination and being completely identified with my thoughts, and every night going to sleep just like thinking about all the social dynamics that had happened and trying to understand what people felt inside, and really over analyzing. My mind, the physics and math mind in me, was just applying itself to social dynamics. And had someone had the tools that I now have, in a month they would have just like pulled the rug out from any of those things being able to exist in the same way. A lot of these things I'm sure you're familiar with. When people get exposed to certain things like metacognitive awareness, you can't unsee that anymore. You might it might get cloudy again, but that doesn't matter. There's a seed, the seed of enlightenment. This is not toward enlightenment, but there's that seed that, Nisargadatta would use the phrase like, there's an ember that's burning, but you know that the whole barn is going to burn down eventually. It's you can't change that. And so that would have been the case for me. Had I been exposed to these tools at that age, it would have been a one-way street out of depression. And it also would have been the first signal I had had in my whole culture that said that all my feelings were intelligent, that they weren't a problem, that they weren't a chemical imbalance. We are the loneliest culture that humans have ever been. There's a study that came out a couple of years ago that said 39% of people in the United States said that they're not close to anybody anymore.
Wow.
Like, that's, that should be at the top of our list of problems that we need to work on. But we're all in ignorance, and very few people seem to know a way to address that.
One thing I struggle with, right? It's like, I feel like I've gone through this journey. You learn all this. You learn all this about yourself, and it's like, I sometimes feel like I'm sitting on the greatest secret, but the most obvious one, and it's as plain as the nose on my face. And then you really start to connect with others and really have a sense of compassion and feeling, and start to see the pain behind the facade that's driving, that they're using as a protective mechanism, right? And I'm like, surely we should all know this, or society just kind of spiraled in a direction that it just doesn't know itself anymore. Like what the fuck is going on? Like, seriously, you know what I mean? And then you have something like the last 2 years. And it's like, do we already know this? Do people know this, or not? Or is it just where we are as humanity? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, it makes me think of the frog in boiling water. The water boils. It's not actually true, just so I don't spread any false things. That's scientifically not actually the case. The frog will jump out of the water, but it's a great anecdote, right? It's like, you grow up, you're born, your child was just born during COVID, right? It's like, that is the world. Whatever world you're born into, that is the way the world works. And so these trauma that have expanded and deepened over thousands of years are just totally invisible, And from that perspective, to me, the people with, diagnosed depression and anxiety are actually the canaries in the coal mine. They're the most sensitive people that are the first to be thrown totally out of balance by how out of balance and insane our culture is right now. And instead of being told that they're actually really intelligent antennas for what the world needs and the kind of cohesion we need as a herd animal. We are a herd animal. We are a social mammal, that you cannot live alone. And anyone that thinks otherwise is basically deluding themselves. Where did my water come from, right? There's whole infinite structures of infrastructure to connect us. So this is all invisible to most people. And so I really see the people like myself that suffered so deeply as the ones that are potentially pointing us to these deep, deep human needs. But at 2022, most of them are being told that it's chemical imbalance, and you just got to add another chemical. And what a tragedy! I think we're going to look back 100 years from now, if we make it through the next 100 years. We're going to look back just the way we look back hundreds of years ago, and we see people drilling holes in their skulls, and we're just like, how would you think that this would be a good thing? We're literally like, we're just not addressing the problem at all. We're living by these kind of weird folk belief systems that are not even backed up by the evidence anymore. So it's a tragedy of such incredible proportions. And like you said, it feels like you get exposed to this secret that is priceless. Someone's put it really well. They said it's like this priceless secret that no one even knows that they want. Because as you said, there's that willingness, that openness, from what I've seen, is usually only gotten to by people that have a sufficient amount of pain.
Yeah.
If you're comfortable enough and you've set up your life well enough to distract and numb from that pain, you're not going to want to go to those darker places. And yeah, it comes back to this animal thing, It's a couple 100,000 years ago, we're not Homo sapien, and now we are. And now we're like super modern, internet connected, super addicted Homo sapien that think that it's a norm that you have a partner and a child in a house disconnected from the tribe. And then you see every parent get like overstressed by the amount of work it is to try to do that. And it's like, no, that's a signal of the insanity of our culture right now. It doesn't need to be like that.
Totally. So bringing it back to Sleepawake, I went off on a slight tangent there, but it's one that it just gets me.
Me too.
So when conceptualizing the camp and bringing it together, I believe, is there more than one of you that are doing this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my good friend Kat Tweedy, we were in undergrad at MIT together like 20 something years ago. And when I shared the idea with some friends, she called me up and said that she wanted to make it with me. So we've been working on it together. And now we have all the counselors, and that's all up on the website. And you can see all the counselors that are teaching all of the different pillars. And
yeah, amazing. And it's in Hawaii, I believe, the first one. And
it's in.
When is it?
Go ahead. Yeah, it's end of July. It's end of July to end of August, basically. It's a 30-day program on the Big Island, in the southeast corner of the Big Island, which is like the most wild of the Big Island. It's really jungly out there, and it really feels fit for transformative work. You're in that thing, in that heat of the jungle, and we're on this beautiful property that's been used as a retreat center for 40 years with 300 fruit trees on it. We're going to be working the land as part of the camp, so you're really going to be, for example, one of the pillars of camp is nutrition. Really take nourishment, we would even call it, beyond nutrition. And part of that is learning how to get your hands in the soil, how to plant the plants, how to actually harvest them, how to turn them all the way from seed to plant onto the plate. And that's, for example, one of the many things that I never learned. I didn't know how to cook for myself until my 30s. And that drastically changed my level of well-being.
Wow. Yeah, it's funny. I heard Chris Kresser, he put a stat out. I don't know if you're familiar with Chris Kresser, but he's an amazing guy in America, like a holistic practitioner. And he put a stat out that between the age, in America, between the age of 12 and 18 or whatever, the average kid is, I think, 75% junk food is their diet now, processed and junk food. Like huge, like ridiculous stats, you're just like, that going back to that insane culture,
Totally. I mean, just to point out around the pillar of nourishment and nutrition, we're going to be doing a lot of incredible tools. We've just learned so many things over the last 15 years, searching for myself and Kat as well. And all the counselors have their specialty. But the baseline is that you're going to be away from the internet for 30 days in nature, off of a computer, eating clean food. And that's just the baseline before we do anything. And you're going to be exercising every day. So like before we teach you anything about tools, about emotional regulation or relational intelligence or anything like that, most people have never spent more than a day off the internet if they've grown up in this kind of internet world. And so that's a utter nervous system reset that people won't have ever had.
Wow.
So it's just like that. Those things feel like they're super easy shifts.
So how do you, like, when putting this out there, I wonder, because one thing we get after our retreats is quite often, you got to do something for the kids and this and that. And my answer is always the same. Well, if you want to impact your children, you're going to impact yourself and be the example. And it all starts from there. So when it comes to 18 to 24-year-olds, are they going to come kicking and screaming and sent by their parents, or are they going to come by their own volition? Or
They won't get in if they're kicking and screaming. We have a pretty intense interview and application process. Even we design the application itself to be a transformational process. So even if someone just has curiosity, we really invite them to fill out the application, because it will engage introspection about their life and the nature of their life, and how do they feel about these different aspects of their life, and what are the challenges they have in relationships, for example. So they have to go through that, and then they have to have an interview with us, and yeah, we're very tuned into where the motivation is coming from. Is it sourced internally, or is it because a parent thinks it's the best thing? And that person's not going to make it into camp. It's not our interest, because as you said, if the internal willingness is not there, nothing else is going to happen.
yeah, absolutely. And then once they walk through that door, they're ready, and it becomes a joy to work with.
Yeah.
Let's touch on let's touch on what you're going to cover then, while we still got time, because I'd love to dive in, because
Sure.
I believe there's 6 areas that you kind of cover over the 30 days, and we obviously touched on physical health and nutrition.
Yeah, I'll just kind of rip through them, and then we can go down any rabbit hole that's of interest to you. The first one we call physical health and nutrition. So you'll be doing yoga every day, which helps you synchronize your breath with your body and helps you stretch and helps you engage through your core and all that sort of thing. You'll be doing exercise every day. You'll be tracking your hydration. For example, I was dehydrated until I was like 38 years old. I didn't even know, because it was the kind of baseline. And you'll be doing exercise every day, and you'll be learning how to cook and how to garden and all those kind of really baseline feet on the ground elements. That's the first pillar. The second one is self-awareness. So learning about the relationship between awareness and thoughts and metacognition, and the fact that you can disidentify from those thought processes, and what do you want your relationship with your thoughts to be, and what is the nature of consciousness, and how does it relate to your life. I just paused, because I really was taking in for a second, wow, someone could have just said some of these things for 10 seconds when I was 18, and they would have just already shifted, And so I'll just say the thing that was in my head. Right now, if you're listening, you can just make your thoughts say, this is the voice that I'm listening to. And right away, there's a subject object. At least there should be confusion, because there's some kind of auditory hallucination happening, and I'm noticing it. So what is going on? And the fact that I can make the thoughts say different things consciously, but normally they run my life. So that's like a little micro experiment, just to kind of course correct something. The third pillar is embodiment. So yoga starts to get into that, but actually learning about authentic movement, about the intelligence in your body, about healthy sexuality, which is things like consent and boundaries, and the fact that your body can be a really deep vehicle for joy, instead of something that you have to deal with to get around, to move your head around, which is how a lot of the culture that I grew up in works. The fourth pillar is creative expression. So I'm a musician and a visual artist, and I've worked a lot on how to actually widen the bandwidth, widen the path for how much of my really deep true self can come through my creative expression without being bounded by shame or worry about people's judgment. And that we all have this really unique voice that gets kind of averaged out and rounded off, because we want to play it safe. So doing a lot of specific practices around opening that channel in your throat and getting your unique self out. The fifth pillar is kind of like the permeating pillar that coheres everything, which is the emotional and relational intelligence pillar. And that's everything about stress patterns and how does your body react to them, and how to work with them, how to ground yourself, how to stay in connection with other people, how to work through conflict, how to track your intelligence, connect the mind and body together. There's all of these things. Of course, we could go on for hours and hours about any one of these pillars. And then maybe the core around that is that your actual authentic self is the deepest pathway to your healing and your deepest relationships. And a lot of the people that feel the most disconnected are holding like 80% of themselves hostage because they think that it's going to get in the way of connection, but it's actually the real pathway to connection. So that's the fifth pillar, as I said, which is kind of the unifying factor. And then the last one I'm calling mental maps. For me, I was never given any maps of these things. For example, trauma patterns, stress patterns, the different sources of intelligence in the body, the way that consciousness evolves into adulthood. And so you're actually made up of the way that the map that I'm making is, you're made up of 7 different forms of intelligence. And that's, of course, just like Roy G. Biv is an approximation of infinite amount of color. Your somatic intelligence is very different from the forms of thoughts that you have. So learning that there's a map of all these different things and getting to reference and learn and gain fluency in those different dimensions. So that's an overview of the 6 pillars of Sleepawake. Oh, and just to answer that other question, Sleep Awake was just a play on words. I went to Sleepawake Camp for, I think 8 years. I went for 2 months every summer to a Sleepawake Camp. And those were some of the best times in my life growing up. And so I have a deep affinity for Sleepaway Camp, and this is technically a sleepaway camp. But it's really about the fact that in some sense, a large fraction of us as an adult is typically walking around asleep. We're just dazed, we're numb, we're not fully awake into ourselves and into our moment by moment authenticity and being. And so it's a nod to that. It's a pointer to the fact that you can actually be awake all the time. And in fact, if you go down the deep meditative traditions, there are plenty of people that literally are awake all through their sleeping hours. Their awareness is so pervasive and foundational that it never gets obscured. There are no clouds that ever get in the way anymore. So we won't try to get anyone there between 18 and 24, but there's pointers toward the fact that this is even a possibility. Like, no one told me that this was even a possibility until 10 years ago. So that was a mouthful.
Wow, no, it sounds incredible, mate. And I'm putting myself back to my 18 to 24-year-old, you know what I mean? And I was so lost, so lost. And for you to be setting up an environment like this to give people, an adult essentially, to step into the world and an opportunity like this to wow, it's just the trajectory that could intersect and change of a person's life is just mind-boggling when you think about it. Absolutely mind-boggling, the potential it has. What are your visions for this moving forward? Like where do you see it going, or is you just in the creative flow and you're just rolling?
It's a really strong creative tension right now to hold a long-term vision and to completely focus only on this year. That's the balance that I'm holding all the time right now. And so right now we're really focusing on getting the right campers or students or whatever the name should be for this inaugural season. But the initial vision was that, we'll be taking data and we'll be tracking not only what does this make someone feel like the day after camp, but a year later, are they really integrating all the shifts that we've given, all the tools? Because I've been through so many workshops where you have these cathartic shifts and then 2 weeks later, you're exactly where you were before because you didn't actually evolve yourself. So I want to actually make sure that these things stick, that this is not some kind of temporary shift. And so we're going to be data tracking. And if the data starts to show that tracking integrated shift, we're working with some universities to try to actually get them to pick up long-term. Maybe we can get some portion of their incoming class to learn these skills. And then, there's some, I've seen some data that says once you have about a 5 to 10% of a culture have a certain type of consciousness, it tends to proliferate through the culture. And so that's one of the things I'm really curious about right now. If you could have, for example, at MIT, when I was there, it had one of the highest suicide rates of any university. It was very hard because so much pressure, self-pressure, critical thought, all that sort of thing. And once that's there, sorry, someone's ringing the doorbell and I'm not going to get it. So they're just distracting me a little bit. Once that's there, what really happens? What happens? Can you actually infuse 50 of the incoming 1,000 students with all these tools? And then does that actually permanently shift the well-being of all the students for not only for the 4 years, but for the rest of their lives? That's the real question. So that's the big vision. If we can make a proof that that starts to actually shift cultural norms, then that's a one-way street, I think, where people will want this to become a normative part of our educational system and not any longer this kind of weird side program.
Yeah, it totally makes sense, doesn't it? Like if I had even somebody then I was around that was setting an example that was embodying this work and then could start to really impact somebody else within, your circle of influence, and becomes a very powerful thing
Mm,
off the bat right there, without a doubt. One
absolutely.
question that came into me then is that, like, looking at people that come to our retreat and the stats we have, and transferring over to the podcast, the average age is between 40 and 50 years old. Okay, they've kind of
Mm,
gone through
yeah.
a life cycle, if you like, within it, and now they're like, shit, why me? What now? and then they start
Yeah.
looking into this work. Not everyone. We do get younger people coming through, but it's not the norm. So I'm just thinking of the listeners right now. They might have teenage kids, they might be early 20s. Definitely there'll be in that spectrum of listeners. In that, what would your advice be, or suggestions to them, if, because they'd be pricking up? Because I'm sure, if as a conscious parent, if you're going to be a conscious parent listening to this podcast, and certainly wanting to evolve the self, instantly you're going to go, oh my god, I really want my kids to go there. That sounds amazing. So like, it's only natural. Any tips or advice of how you would then present the work like this to that
Mm.
age group, to look at what you were doing without feeling
Yeah.
invasive?
Yeah, I think that's a great pointer and question. And also the word that you used, invasive, I think is the core of my answer. I would I would share it with excitement and with no form of pressure. In my experience, the students that we've talked to that this is right for, they are head over heels ready for this. Didn't know they were waiting for this kind of opportunity. They've already see the struggle. There's more and more people. This is the kind of irony of the whole situation. Mental health is not going well at all right now. It's actually accelerating worse. We're in the worst kind of rates of depression and anxiety that I've ever seen, and they're accelerating worse. So the people that are exposed to this, that are 20 years old, that are already feeling all of that, they know something's wrong, and they will already have that internal willingness. So if a parent needs to kind of, there might be, of course, be resistance based on fear, but that's a very kind of different thing than resistance based on, mom, you're pushing this on me. And so I think if a parent can just check themselves, am I doing this because I'm interested, or am I sharing this because I feel like they really might be interested, and pull themselves in. That's the only way it's going to work anyway. Someone can very easily go to this camp, walk the walk, and get nothing out of it because they've disassociated the whole time because they're not interested. So in that sense, invasion and pushing won't actually be of benefit to them in the first place. So it really is, where I was at 18, I would have just clambered my way up a mountain to get access to something like this. And that's been our experience in the interviews that we've had so far. It's like the people that are resonant are just like, thank you for making this an existing offer.
Yeah.
So that's how I want the camping system to be. I want to just let the people in that are wanting it deeply.
Amazing. So if they want to reach out, and so I'm assuming the Sleepawake website is the best place to contact you, to take the application further from that point there.
Yeah, so there's our website is sleepawake.camp, and I'm sure you'll have the link and everything like that. There's on the apply page, you can schedule a 30-minute intro call with us just to get to know each other, ask any questions you might have. There's a 30-minute video where we really outline the curriculum more, and you get to feel Kat and myself. And then there's the application and interview process that would follow that. And our emails are on there as well, so it's pretty easy to reach out directly with any questions.
Incredible. Well, for everyone listening, whether it be YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, whatever you're listening to this, you can pause, and there'll be links below, in the show notes underneath. I got one last question for you, Jeff, before we wrap things up. And that is,
Yeah.
with everything we've covered today, is there anything you'd like to leave the listeners to ponder on?
What would your life look like if you were internally coherent with yourself? And the flip side of that is, what are the ways that you are actually suffocating the self that you know is inside based on beliefs? And how sure are you that those beliefs are real and not just a projection from your history?
Perfect. Amazing. Jeff, I just want to thank you for coming on the show today. Thank you for, it's been amazing. Everything that you're doing is just wonderful, mate. And I just wish you all the very best for the success of it all. And I'm sure it will be a roaring success. And hopefully in one day we'll meet in person, mate, at some stage in life as we go through. But thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Guy. It's great to see you again, and I agree. Sometime when we're in a different phase, we'll have one of these chats in person.
Cheers.